Hi, I'm Weiland, and welcome to this week's video, which is a continuation of what we talked about last time when we started covering kind of a checklist of important elements to consider for your story's beginning. Last time we specifically talked about what you need to consider in regards to character and all of the many elements that you can use both to enhance character in the beginning and to use character to really create an awesome beginning that hooks readers in. Now, I talked in that video just about how complex a topic that beginnings are and how really just the first chapter has so many moving pieces and so many things to think about, not just in hooking readers and convincing them this is an entertaining story, but also in laying the groundwork for everything to follow, because if it doesn't do that, then it really does compromise the story that follows. So I wanted to divide it into two videos because really there's just so much to talk about. And even then, we're not covering like even a tenth of everything that there is to consider about beginning. So as always, I will leave lots of resources down below if you're watching on YouTube. And if you are listening to this as a podcast, then you can find the complete transcript of this on my website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. So in this week's video, we're going to be talking about plot considerations for your story's beginning. So obviously character is a huge part of this. You can't have plot without character. So beginning with some of the things that we talked about in the last video as a foundation is very important in creating or highlighting elements of your character's personality that are really going to drive the conflict, in showing your character's relationship to the thematic lie and truth, which are going to drive their character arc, and which in turn is really going to influence what they want and how they interact in the plot. So one of the first things to consider in introducing the plot in your story's beginning is that basically every scene in your story is like a domino in a row of dominoes. So you know how people create those really elaborate designs, and if you push one domino over, it creates this chain reaction, and every domino has to be perfectly in place for this to happen, or that the action comes to a halt. And at best, the person has to come in and, nudge the next domino along to recreate the chain reaction. So the first domino in your plot's line of dominoes is this first scene. So you have to really think about, how does this set up the chain reaction that's going to follow? It can't just be this arbitrary scene that's tacked on in order to accomplish other important things that have to happen in the beginning, such as introducing characters or even just hooking readers. It has to do so in a way that is very integral to the entire story and that creates this sense of cohesion and resonance. So plot in a nutshell, we can simply think of it as the character wants something, right? They have a goal, and that goal is going to be met with obstacles, which is what creates the conflict and therefore the entire drama of the story. So it all begins with something that your character wants. And in plot, this is going to be something specific, right? It's going to be the plot goal, whatever that may be in your story, whether it's a relationship they want to be with somebody, whether it's, an actual item that they're pursuing that they need, whether it's, to defeat an enemy, whatever it is. It can be something very specific, like they're going to get the thing and hold it in their hand, or it can be something more abstract. Whatever it is, it's going to be something specific within the plot. But that specific thing is going to be driven by a deeper desire on your character's part. And this is the thing your character wants. And so this is something to really consider in the beginning of your story. And it's very important in setting up this first chapter, because the plot goal, that specific plot goal, is something that's going to kind of gel as the story goes along. And particularly throughout the third act, it may not be something the character specifically is as after or even knows about necessarily. It may not, fully come into view until the beginning of the second act. But you still have this whole first part of your story that you have to fill with stuff that has to happen that's going to engage readers and make them want to read on until they get to that full immersion in the story's drama. So what do? What drives the plot in this early part of the story? And the answer to that, again, is the thing your character wants. And this specifically is something that's a deeper desire. It's a deeper want that is going to then fuel the desire and the need for that plot goal as the story progresses. It's going to sort of funnel down into something that's more specific. But this want, and we talked about this a little bit in the last video, this want is something that is going to be founded upon and driven by the character's relationship to the story's thematic lie, to the lie the character believes. And again, this is a limited perspective that the character holds, a limiting belief about themselves or the world they live in that is motivating their actions in a way that is ultimately dysfunctional. And it's becoming increasingly so within the events of your specific story. So think about, in this first scene, as you're crafting your story's beginning, think about what it is. What is the thing your character wants? And so even if you're not yet able to craft an opening scene that is specifically involved with the plot goal that will come to light later on, you can still craft a scene that is very much based around the character's desire, around the thing that they want, whatever that is, in this opening scene. And in so doing, you get the opportunity to also dramatize their relationship to the lie, their relationship to the normal world, the things that we talked about that are more character-based in the last video. Think about the thing your character wants. You can also think about the thing your character needs, which is something that is in contrast to this want, and usually just generally is the truth that the character will come to believe as the story goes on. It is the more expanded mindset that's going to be in contrast to the limitations with which they start out. And obviously they don't have that at this point in the story, and they may never get it depending on what type of arc they're following. But in a positive arc, they won't find that until the end of the story. But you can use your awareness of the thing they need and their lack of it to show, how they're interacting with the thing they want, how they're trying to pursue the want as kind of a replacement for the need. So like a basic example of this would be they need to let somebody love them, but their want, is to fill that need via other things. Maybe they're, want to be a pop star or something, and fame, right? They think they want fame when really what they need is love. And that's a very, very general example, but you kind of can get the idea from that of how, maybe the story is about, falling in love, or maybe it's about, reuniting with an estranged parent or something like that, that's going to help the character evolve their perspective of and their relationship to love and to themselves and to loving themselves ultimately. But, you're setting up this plot in which they're pursuing this mistaken mode of trying to get this via their pursuit of fame. I'm going to become a famous pop star and everybody's going to love me. That kind of thing. And you can start setting that up in the very first chapter, even as you're allowing the rest of that to develop and bringing in the dynamics that are really going to start challenging that mindset and making it difficult for the character to get what they need via what they think they want. So think about setting that up in your very first scene and even using that, as the scene goals, to set up early scene goals and early scene conflict before the character is fully engaged with the antagonistic force as that progresses later on in the first act. Okay, so from a structural perspective, the main function of the beginning in general is to set up the story that is to follow, right? It's to introduce all of the important elements, whether that's the characters, the settings, the stakes, the theme, just the pieces of your character's arc, the lie that the character believes, the thematic truth, the thing they want, the thing they need. All of that has to be introduced within the first act of your story. And usually you will at the very least start foreshadowing almost all of those things from the very beginning, from the very first scene in the first chapter. A couple of ways that you can kind of leverage this and think about it to try to make sure that you're bringing in all these crazy disparate elements that have to, start happening within a very confined space within your story is to think about the relationship, the structural relationship of this first chapter to other important structural moments throughout the story. So first and foremost, what happens in the beginning of your story, whether it's exactly the first chapter or a little later on, but that opening, what happens there is something that is going to set up and therefore foreshadow whatever happens at your story's first plot point. So the first plot point happens around the 25% mark, and it's the kind of the doorway between the first act and the second act. So it's a big moment. It is the moment where your character becomes fully engaged with the story's main conflict against the antagonistic force in your story, whatever is creating obstacles to the character getting what they want and what they need. So think about how you can set that up in the very first chapter. How, even if it's just subtle, right? It's still that first domino in the row of dominoes. How is what's happening in this opening scene that you've chosen creating this line of cause and effect within your plot that is going to lead your character to the first plot point? And if you realize that maybe some of your ideas for how to open your story and create this beginning chapter don't really seem to influence the first plot point, then it is definitely possible that you're beginning too soon. Because the true beginning of your story is that moment where the character's life begins to change, right? It's not dramatic yet, it's not overt, but very subtly the circumstances are changing. Their own inner experience is changing in a way that means they cannot remain the way they are anymore. And this could be, largely external circumstances. Maybe their neighborhood's going to, be condemned or something, and they're going to have to move, whether they want to or not. Or it could be, just internal circumstances, which is, what we see very often in archetypal character arcs, such as what I talk about in my book, Writing Archetypal Character Arcs. In that life circumstances, wherever you're at within the life arc, brings you to a point where you're changing. Puberty is a great example, right? It's like you don't get a choice. You're going on this next character arc into adulthood. So that moment, whether it's something that's happening externally against the character's will or internally that really they can't help, or maybe they're excited for it. Maybe they think they know what they're getting into and they want it. Either way, something is changing, and it's really subtle, right? It's not at a point where they even recognize that their life is going to change forever, but it's the first rumblings of that. That's where you want to begin your story, because that is what's then going to lead into and foreshadow the first plot point at the end of the first act. And one other thing that you can kind of think about structurally that's kind of fun in setting up your beginning, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more, I think, in the next video when I talk about endings, but that is how your beginning, how the hook in your story's beginning actually mirrors and sets up the resolution in your story's ending. So the first scene and the last scene. So the structural point and job of the first chapter is to act as a hook for readers, right? It's to pull them in. It's to create that opening dynamic and that opening situation that not only kicks off the plot, but that's, pulls readers in and is interested. So the hook is that first beat in your story's structure. And it's something that by the time you get to the resolution, whatever happens in the beginning, even if it seems very ancillary to the rest of the story, by the time you get to the end, there should be a harmony. And it doesn't have to be overt. It doesn't have to be necessarily like, say, the character returns to wherever they were in the beginning of the story in that first scene, and they see the same characters. And sometimes that will happen, and it can be an extremely effective way to bring the story full circle and to show how the character and or the world has changed because of the effects of the story. But it can be much subtler than that. Sometimes it is literally just mirroring whatever the characteristic moment was in the beginning with another characteristic moment in the very end that shows how the character has changed. They're in a similar circumstance, but they have changed, or maybe they haven't, and that's what you're trying to emphasize. But, obviously it helps if you know how you want to end your story. And sometimes you won't necessarily, realize that something you've created in the opening scene is something that you can and will mirror by the time you do get to the ending. But just kind of keeping that in mind and realizing that even if the beginning of the story seems very separate from what's going to be the main conflict, that you can help it seem like a cohesive whole and bring it full circle by thinking about how any questions, whether they're overt or just, subtextual, that you're raising in that first chapter can eventually be answered in the end. And again, this can be very subtle. It probably isn't something that you want readers thinking about throughout the whole story, but you can sow those little seeds that can come to fruition at the end and just make the whole story feel very grounded and resonant and purposeful. Even if you didn't intend it, even if it just magically happens, you know, in the end that you're mirroring something in the beginning that you didn't even realize could be foreshadowing. It makes the story seem very intentional, which is, you know, always a great reading experience. Okay, so the last couple things I want to talk about are just techniques for opening your story. Things that you can use to, you know, take all of these elements that you've made sure are in your beginning and that are laying the foundation for the story that will follow and giving it these really strong roots, right, from which it can grow this amazing story. Then how do you take that and then apply it, you know, to the actual story and bring those techniques to life in a way that works for readers? You know, because it's one thing for you to say, you know, this and this and this happens, and another thing to dramatize it in, you know, through words in a way that readers really do enjoy and relate to, that you've shown it to them rather than told them, right? So again, the hook is the primary thing that you're trying to accomplish as far as just pulling readers in with all of the great stuff, you know, that you're trying to share with them in the story. And there are many, many different ways to do this. I think the simplest, like the bottom line of what a hook is and how to think about it is to think of it as a question, right? You're trying to pique readers' curiosity. And you're not necessarily trying to get them to ask an explicit question, but you do want to just pique their curiosity and make them wonder, what's going to happen with this dynamic? You know, what's going to happen? You know, what are the consequences of what just happened in this story? Or asking what would make someone do this? You know, we've talked about backstory in previous videos and how that can create this whole layer of subtext in which it makes readers wonder, you know, why would someone do this? What's the motivation? So whatever it is, you know, thinking about how you can sew these little hooks that get readers curious. And if they're curious, they keep reading. So, you know, they can be lots of things. Part of it is just, I want to know what's going to happen in the plot. But some of it too can be these little things like backstory and motive and stuff like that, that is just enough of a little hook to pull them along until you can start planning bigger and bigger hooks as you continue to develop the main plot. Now, one relatively popular way of trying to hook readers and beginning a story is in medias res, which I'm always pronouncing wrong, so that's probably wrong. But it means, it's Latin, it means in the middle of things. And basically it means opening the story in the middle of the action. So very often we'd see this in, you know, like say action stories that begin, like there's already a battle going on, right? There's already something, you know, a car chase or a battle or whatever. And we're just plunged right into the middle of it. And we don't know what's going on. We don't know why these characters are doing this or, you know, what's at stake necessarily. It's just action. And again, it doesn't have to be like action depending on the context of your story. Maybe it's relational. Maybe you open, you know, right smack in the middle of characters breaking up or, you know, something like that. But regardless, the idea is that you're kind of cutting out the throat clearing and all the stuff, the explanation of what's happening, and just getting readers right into the good stuff. And this can be very effective, but it's also quite tricky because particularly in written fiction, it's different in visual fiction like movies. But particularly in written fiction, readers need a reason to invest in reading about action because very often action is quite dense. It's not something that is the easiest thing to just immediately jump in and be interested in. And readers need a reason to care. They need a reason to know why your character is running through the streets or, you know, whatever. So very often it's better to pull that back until at least later in the first chapter, if not later altogether. However, the exception here is understanding what it means to open in the middle of the action. So, I can't remember if I talked about this in this video or the previous one, but I mentioned how valuable it can be to open with your character in motion, right? That they are moving towards something. And it doesn't necessarily mean like they're running through the streets or they're shooting it out or some big action moment. It just means that there's a sense of movement, right? They're moving towards something. There's momentum. There's a sense that they want something. And therefore there's a sense that there's plot, right? There's a goal and there's the opportunity for that goal to be obstructed, which is conflict. If you can just impart that is often enough to allow your story to open in a way that cuts through the throat clearing, gets straight to the point of what the character is doing in this first chapter, in this first scene, without asking readers to invest themselves in a story that they don't know anything about, in a really intense scene where they don't yet know who they're sympathizing with, who they're identified with, that kind of thing. And again, I think I talked about this in the last video as well, very often opening with dialogue is one of the best ways to begin in the action, because dialogue actually is action. It is, I like to say, the purest form of showing rather than telling, because it literally, you don't have to describe it, you don't have to explain it, it just is straight from the horse's mouth, right? Straight from the character's mouth. So not to say necessarily you want your first line to be dialogue, and you probably do not want a dialogue conversation without context, without, you know, giving dialogue tags and pointing out who characters are. But the back and forth of dialogue does give you the opportunity to get readers into the action of the story, while also sewing in little bits of information about the characters who are speaking and whatever they're doing, their action beats, as they go. So that's not appropriate for every story. Obviously, the situation that you're trying to convey in your opening chapter will have a lot to do with that decision. But it is, generally speaking, a very effective technique for grabbing readers, for, you know, creating that perfect balance between action and forward momentum, with also, you know, giving readers an opportunity to invest in characters, to understand what's going on, who's talking, what they're doing, what they want, that kind of thing. I hope that's helpful. Again, beginnings have so much ground to cover, so many things that we could talk about. But that, between the last time's video and this one, hopefully that's a good overview of all of the basic elements and considerations for crafting a really solid beginning that both sets the groundwork for the plot and the whole story to come, and hooks readers and gives them a reason to be interested in the story that you have to tell them. So if you'd like to stay in touch with me and all of the content that I produce, in addition to these videos, I also do a weekly post and podcast on my website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. And the best way to stay in touch with all of that and all of the other resources that I produce is to sign up for my mailing list at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com/mailing list. And if you're interested, you can also connect with me on Instagram at author KM Weiland, where I post lots of good stuff, including just musings about life and that sort of thing that I don't post anywhere else. So I hope to see you around, and if not, I will see you in the next video. Till then, happy writing.